If we are right about our understanding that Srila Prabhupada never wanted us to go down this multi-guru path, that he actually wanted us to continue on the path he had set up, the Rtvik RAS path, then a good question would be, why? Why would Srila Prabhupada have wanted to remain the Diksha Guru for ISKCON? He had said many times that he wanted all his disciples to become bona fide gurus and take our own disciples. So why would he have then wanted, in the end, to have continued to take his own disciples after he departed? That's a very good question. My analysis is that while the Gaudiya Math was a fair-sized organization in India at the time Srila Bhaktisiddhanta left this world, when Srila Prabhupada departed, ISKCON was actually much greater, and it had just barely started. It was truly an international organization with centers all over the world. By 1977, it had been growing by leaps and bounds. Srila Prabhupada had established a substantial worldwide mission in parts of the world where no other Krishna consciousness had ever existed, at least not in the current Kali Yuga. His ISKCON mission was expanding with great speed, the Hare Krishna explosion. People were turning to his mission by the tens of thousands, and it had just barely begun. When Srila Bhaktisiddhanta left this world, he didn't select the next acharya. He told that the next acharya will become self-evident. There may be many stars in the night sky, but when the full moon rises, it becomes vividly obvious. It took over 30 years before Srila Prabhupada's moon rose up and he began ISKCON and began taking his own disciples. When Srila Bhaktisiddhanta departed, he didn't see anyone who was ready yet to become the next acharya. Since there was no one was yet ready, then for a minimum of 3 decades, there wound up being no bona fide acharya in our sampradaya. Better that there would have been no guru at all than an impure, empty, show bottle, useless, rascal guru who poses as guru and then falls down. The most important thing was that the next guru be actually qualified. If that meant that there would be no other guru for years, for decades, then so be it. What was of paramount importance was that the next acharya be 100% truly qualified. So when it was time for Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati to leave this world, and there was no one who was yet qualified, even if it meant the world would be without a bona fide acharya for decades, that was what would have to happen. But at that time, the followers of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati virtually all lived in India. And in India, there were 5,000 Krishna temples in Vrindavan alone. Vedic culture and Gita and Krishna was, at least in some way, a part of everybody's lives in India at the time. That provided a large social safety net, where even though there were no bona fide Vaishnava gurus, no Brahma Madhva Gaudiya gurus for decades, still, if one was sincere to go back to Krishna, there were paths that Krishna could provide to give the sincere soul in India at that time the opportunity. But when it was time for our Srila Prabhupada to leave, the circumstances were totally different. Srila Prabhupada had just started an international mission where many members were spreading Lord Chaitanya's mission to towns and villages where no glimpse of Krishna consciousness existed. Outside of ISKCON, so many lost souls around the entire planet who were just beginning to have contact with our mission, they had no other path available to them than ISKCON, if they sincerely wanted to take up Krishna consciousness. When Srila Bhaktisiddhanta left this world, virtually all of his followers were in India, and there were many paths at that time that a sincere soul can take. But when Srila Prabhupada left, the only path available in North Central, South America, Africa, Europe, Russia, China, the whole world outside of India. There was no other path. And even in India by 1977, the masses were running away from Krishna and Vedic culture and were embracing Western life and modern atheistic ideas. Many of the paths and safety nets that had been there 50 years earlier were fading away. So when Srila Prabhupada was leaving, what if none of his disciples were yet fully qualified? What if there was no one who was a real pure devotee who could give all the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of people who would be coming in the coming years, who would turn toward ISKCON? What if there were no pure devotees and qualified gurus to give those people the guidance and shelter that they needed? Obviously, the 11 men the GBC promoted as the next acharyas had not completed their training yet. So many of them fell down within a few short years. The fact is, and the GBC have admitted, Srila Prabhupada didn't actually appoint them to become gurus. At the time, the GBC mistakenly thought he had, but the fact is, he hadn't. The example set by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, which was upheld by our Srila Prabhupada, was that if there was no one fully qualified and ready, then the acharya cannot appoint an unfit man to pose as guru. Remember that on April 22nd, 1977, Tamal Krishna had, in a conversation with Srila Prabhupada, Tamal Krishna had told Srila Prabhupada that he knows he wasn't qualified, and he said he's assessed all of Prabhupada's other disciples, and as far as he was concerned, no one was qualified to become guru. That was April 22nd, 1977, and Srila Prabhupada agreed. That was just 4 weeks, I think 4 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks before the May 28th meeting. It was just a few months, like 2.5, 3 months before Prabhupada wrote the July 9th letter, and Prabhupada admitted that none of his disciples were yet qualified. So at the time when Srila Prabhupada was leaving, which was that time, and Srila Prabhupada saw that no one had actually come to the highest platform to be the next acharya, the next genuine acharya. The purity and the integrity of the sampradaya has to be maintained. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada would not have selected anyone to become guru. But then what? Then what would Srila Prabhupada have done? Would he have done what his spiritual master had done? Would he have just simply selected no one? No, because the situation was different. He had just started a worldwide mission where tens of thousands were just awakening their desire to take up spiritual life for the first time. Who was going to give them the guidance and shelter they needed if Srila Prabhupada couldn't select anyone else to become the next acharya? What would be the fate of all those souls who were just starting to awaken their spiritual life and needed the shelter of a pure devotee so they could take up Krishna consciousness? What would be their fate if there was no one qualified to give them that shelter? Should Srila Prabhupada just not select anyone as his guru did? When Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati left, it took 3 decades before Srila Prabhupada manifested his qualifications and started the ISKCON mission. And he began to give shelter to the fallen souls of this world. He came to the West where there was zero knowledge of Krishna, and he made Krishna a household name. He created devotees of Krishna by the thousands where none existed before. He took hippies and turned them into happies, he said, into Krishna, into the Hare Krishnas. He went to places that were totally devoid of Krishna consciousness and awakened Krishna in so many hearts. He had planted millions and millions of seeds in the forms of his books all over the world where no Krishna conscious creepers had ever grown for ages, if at all, in the whole day of Lord Brahma. All those millions and millions of seeds that he planted would be sprouting up and they would require the shelter that only a pure devotee and a fully qualified guru can give them. If there was no one yet qualified, when it was time for him to leave, should he have done what his spiritual master had done and simply selected no one? When it had taken 3 decades before Srila Prabhupada rose up, how many more decades would it take before another qualified guru were to rise up? What if it were to take 100 years instead of 30? What if it were to take 1,000 years? Then all those millions of seeds that have been planted, would sprout up, and there would be no one there to give them the shelter they needed. It is my conclusion that the reason Srila Prabhupada chose to remain available as a bona fide shelter and chose to continue to accept disciples even after he leaves his Vapu form was because he knew the circumstances were very unusual. He could see what he had accomplished and that he knew what he had planted, so many millions of seeds, and he knew all those seeds would need the shelter that only a real Mahabhagavat, a qualified and actual pure devotee, can give. Srila Prabhupada saw how he had been delegating so many of the physical aspects of the initiation process, and he realized that it would only require but one last step in the system that he had already been setting up, and it would become a 100% proxy system that no longer would require his physical presence, and yet he could continue to accept disciples and give them his most needed shelter. It is my conclusion that this is why Srila Prabhupada in his final months decided to take such an unusual position, which by then only required but one final additional step to complete. And he chose to remain the initiating, shelter-giving spiritual master for an unseen number of years into the future. He did this out of unfathomable mercy and compassion for the fallen souls. He did this because there was no one else who was yet qualified when it came time for him to leave this world. And even though it was his desire that his disciples would complete their training and would become qualified to take disciples themselves, when his health became critical, he saw no one was ready. And he realized no one would be at any time soon. He saw the unusual circumstance, and just as Madhva Acharya saw the unusual circumstance that the Sampradaya had become lost, the only way that Madhva Acharya saw to restore the disciplic line was for him to do something that was most unusual. He sought out the direct initiation from Srila Vyasadeva, who was no longer visible in his Vapu earthly form. And that way, Madhva Acharya was able to restore the Sampradaya. The same thing when Srila Prabhupada saw it was time for him to leave, but there was no one to take his place. And he realized that there wouldn't be any for who knows how long into the future. And yet the need for there to be the shelter of a genuine guru was even more important than ever. So he had no choice but to take a very unusual step to complete the Rtvik representative system, where he could continue to give his mercy and shelter to all the millions of seeds that he had planted that were sprouting up in the many years ahead. That is why, in my humble view, Srila Prabhupada chose to take the path that he did and chose to finalize the Rtvik representative of the Acharya system, by which he would remain the bona fide Acharya for ISKCON for who knows how many years, decades, centuries, even millennia to come. And for that, Srila Prabhupada should be glorified for who he really is, the most merciful and compassionate Acharya ever.